We spent yesterday talking about broadly how housing supply and housing access happens. And we learned both from the kind of economics and research perspective on that, and then we also heard from a broad group of policymakers. So the focus of yesterday was really to think in a bigger way, how does kind of housing arise in our cities? And kind of consistent with our interest from our Brookings colleagues and our interest here at the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute, we're again taking a fairly big view of that. So we're focused on just broadly for the market as a whole in our metropolitan areas, what is determining access to housing for folks, and how can policies shape that? So today, for the second set of panels that we have, we're going to be talking about what that housing access can confer to people who get it. So today's panels are going to talk about basically how housing links to opportunity and how housing itself shapes outcomes for the residents who live there. So let me clarify for you how this morning's first panel is going to work. File this under best laid plans, and we've had a couple of adventures pulling this panel together. So very regretfully, Marcus Casey at the last minute had a family event, so he cannot join us at all today. Susan Wachter learned yesterday that she could not join us in person, but she is going to be joining us by phone and talking us through her very thoughtful presentation. And then Sandy Newman knew all along that she could not join us in person, and since we are in the middle of the country, we get a little bit creative to get folks here. So for months, we had had in the works having Sandy join us from the Brookings Institution. So we're going to piece all of that together and make a conversation work. So we hope that things run smoothly. We'll appreciate a little bit of patience. I'm incredibly thankful to our tech staff who has stitched this together so far, and to Issi for unflappably running a panel under these conditions. So I think we're going to have a great conversation. We're all much more accustomed to talking to people on screens than we were even 2 years ago. I think this will feel familiar to everyone. But with that, I'll turn it over to Issi, who's going to frame the panel for us. Then next up will be Morris. Then we'll hear from Susan. Then we'll take a few questions, and then we'll bring Sandy in as well to present her perspective, and then have a bit more of a question time then. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby, for that intro, and thanks everyone for coming here this early in the morning. I think we were off to a very good start yesterday. I think we got a very good picture of where housing supply is at, what the constraints are, how and whether they can be lifted. But I think all of that discussion is kind of circumstantial, because in the end, what matters is how all this affects people, and that's where we're headed today. The first three presentations, my own, Morris's, and Susan's, are going to be cross-metropolitan, I think is the best way of putting it. We're going to ask, how are people affected by which metros they can live in? How is their ability to swap between metros, to move, different today than it was? Sandy's presentation that we'll get to at the end is going to talk about individual level outcomes. How are individuals affected by their housing circumstances, things like cognitive outcomes, personal well-being, and such. So I'm going to start off by talking about American cities in general. This is a chart that I use to help understand what kind of cities we have in this country. And by cities, I mean metro areas. Each point on this chart is a metro area. At the top left, you've got San Francisco, which really represents the entire Bay Area, the San Jose metro as well. At the bottom right, you've got Las Vegas. And down at the very bottom left, you've got Cleveland and Pittsburgh. What this chart shows on the vertical axis is what happened to real housing prices from 1980 to 2010, the years of prime divergence between the expensive coastal cities and the rest of the country. On the right-hand side, on the horizontal axis, what you can see is how much metro areas expanded in terms of their developed footprint. So if a metro is at 100, it means that between 1980 and 2010, it doubled its land area. If it's farther, it did more than that. The way I read this chart is that a metro's distance from the origin speaks to how strong the demand is to live there. How much economic mojo does that metro have? So very close to the origin, you've got cities that are concentrated in the Rust Belt and the Midwest. You've got your Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit right there. Those are cities that have seen better days. I've dubbed them legacy cities here. And they have neither seen much price appreciation over this period or much outward expansion. The rest of the US is doing better economically, but it's choosing to do different things with it. The cities up on the top left have, I could talk your ear off about this, but I won't. They've slowed down their outward expansion for both natural geography reasons and let's call it man-made policy reasons. And they've also slowed down their pace of densification, but they've continued to have very strong economies for various reasons, and that means that there's basically a pressure cooker there that results in housing prices going up and in the population having to sort. Only some people can stay as prices go up. Some people must leave. Some people are able to stay and arrive there. So their populations stay relatively stable, and their prices have gone up. At the bottom right, you've got metros that are also doing well economically, but they haven't restricted their growth in the same way that the expensive coastal cities have. They're not densifying very much either for different reasons, and they are expanding to this day very much and adding abundant, affordable housing by expanding their borders, growing into the countryside. Those cities are basically channeling their economic strength into population growth and housing growth, which goes with it. But they're able to maintain their housing affordable. They basically keep it tethered to the cost of construction by allowing developers to build as much as they see fit. Before we move forward, the rest of my slides are basically going to talk about who is able to move between these cities, what this process of sorting in the expensive coastal cities does. And I'll just preface it. What we actually have here is a national population distribution policy that's not determined by the federal government. It's determined by essentially suburban zoning committees. Let's see how it looks. Let's understand this chart. The rest of the charts will have the same structure. So on this chart, on the horizontal axis, you see home values. You see metros represented by points again. More expensive metros on the right, less expensive metros on the left. What you see on the vertical axis is the difference between in-migrants to a metro and out-migrants from that metro with respect to a different variable in each chart. So in this case, we're looking at median annual household income. The chart corresponds to the early 2000s, 2010 to 2016. At the top right, you can see the San Francisco Bay Area. What that tells us is that because San Francisco is high up, well above the red line that marks 0, people moving into San Francisco, on average, live in households that make, give or take, $13,000 more than those who are leaving San Francisco. And this is accounting for the fact that, software developers in the Bay Area are probably paid more than software developers anywhere else in the country. All those within occupation wage differences are accounted for in a rough but reasonable way. What this chart tells us is that the expensive coastal cities are seeing in-migrants who are generally more affluent than those leaving them. That is the population sorting process, pretty much as directly as you can see it in numbers and charts. Okay, the only way of getting closer to the facts in this is, telling personal stories in the newspaper. This is the population sorting across the U.S. At the other end of the spectrum, on the left, you can see that the legacy cities and the Rust Belt is taking in residents who are on average less affluent than those moving in. Those cities that are growing very fast in the south show up in the middle of this chart. You've got your, see if I can point, you've got your Denver over here, San Antonio, Orlando, Atlanta, Dallas. These cities are more or less break even in terms of the affluence of who's moving in and who's moving out. This chart has the same structure. It looks at the number of earners per household, and it can't account for differences between origin and destination the way we can with incomes. So what this means is folks moving into expensive coastal cities and the Bay Area, on average, have more earners per household than those who leave these areas when we look at those leaving after they've arrived somewhere else. So this can reflect people moving to the expensive coastal cities and needing to live with more roommates if they are typically younger, or it can reflect married couples having to have both spouses work. It can also reflect the fact that once you've left these areas, perhaps you have a greater ability not to have a spouse work, or you can afford your own place without roommates. The flip is happening in our legacy cities. And again, we're somewhere in even ground in what I call the expansive cities. This chart looks at age. Here the picture is opposite. Let me start by pointing out Miami, Phoenix, Orlando, Tampa, and I don't think I've got Tucson marked here, but it's also somewhere up here. These are communities that take in folks who are generally much older than those leaving them. That should come as no surprise. It's reassuring to see that in the chart here. What we also see is the expensive coastal cities taking in folks who are generally younger than those leaving. And because I'm not an academic economist, I work for Zillow, I allow myself to speculate a bit more loosely. And the story that I like to tell here is about the Manhattanization of the expensive coastal cities. And what do I mean by that? Manhattanization can mean so many different things. In my kind of stereotypical perception of Manhattan, it's a place where people move in their early 20s when they are full of energy and passion. Then they spend 12 years working at a law firm, morning till evening, never seeing their spouse. And at some point, somewhere between child number 1 and child number 2, and carrying the stroller up 3 floors, they realize they can't do it anymore. They can't afford it. They really want to have a separate room for the baby. And they either move to New Jersey or to Dallas. And Dallas is code for a whole lot of other places in the country too that are just more affordable.
Why is LA in red?
Because the last time I gave this talk, it was in LA.
Should have known.
Yeah, that's yeah. But so what I think we're seeing here is, in some sense, the Manhattanization of these more expensive parts of the country. People are moving there when they are single and able to. Or willing to live with roommates for a longer period and make do with what you can afford off of whatever they make. And then typically at the point of wanting to start a family or expand a family, people hit the breaking point and leave. And then the older folks in the Bay Area will say, oh, they're not planting roots, they're transient residents. We shouldn't build more housing to accommodate them. Or at least that's what you see if you live in the South Bay and read your neighborhood paper. The flip of that is people will argue, we would stay if we could. Moving on. Owner occupancy. So people moving into the expensive coastal cities are less likely to own their homes, more likely to rent than those leaving them. People who have left obviously have an easier time buying. This can reflect what's happening to young people. It can also reflect the tendency of people who have seen their real estate appreciate in these metros, cash out. Basically move to somewhere more affordable and live off the proceeds. I discovered at some point last year, I think, that more than half the people who moved to Las Vegas and Phoenix since the 90s each year have been coming from Southern California. And since then, I've been going around telling people Vegas and Phoenix are really far-flung suburbs of LA. And their main export industry could be retirees bringing their excess cash after selling their houses. But that's again a speculative reading of this. Orlando, Phoenix, Tampa show up high over here as well, reflecting their retirement community status. Last chart of this type, education. These expensive coastal cities are pulling in people who are much more educated than those leaving, and vice versa in the Rust Belt. Some points about that. Income and wealth aren't the same. If you want to buy a home in Manhattan, a really well-paying job isn't going to help you. You generally need to luck out in some amazing way or inherit that wealth or that home. The expensive coastal cities are becoming that way. And I think in the longer run, if this trend continues, we're going to find the cross-generational support. What you get from your parents is going to become more important relative to what you earn. Even a job at Google won't help you. And that's consistent with the notion of a transient class, which is a different term for the Manhattanization of the coastal cities. The income sorting and education sorting that we just saw in these charts are the mechanics of polarization. That's as close as we can get to seeing them in charts. I think that in this day and age, at least for the last 3 years, there's some political implications to this that should be fairly obvious, and I won't name names. Sorry, I'm giving you guys previews because I hit the wrong button. One point that I'll make here, the regressions underlying these charts tell us a little bit more than I can actually show in the charts. So the results with respect to the number of earners in the household and whether people buy or rent fluctuate from year to year as housing prices change. So people respond to housing prices in their choices of how many people to live with, who should go to work, and whether we buy or rent for the short term. What doesn't change from year to year, does not fluctuate with housing prices, is the degree of sorting based on income and education. And my, again, speculative reading of that is that that has more to do with fundamental differences in the industrial mix of cities. Okay, the industries that exist in the expensive coastal cities draw in more educated people and send out less educated people. And those are much slower to change. They do respond to housing prices in the very long run. Okay, only certain industries can exist when housing costs that much, and that affects the industrial mix over the span of decades. From year to year, that stuff is pretty stable. And that relates to the next chart. So this is the last slide. You might have seen this one in the New York Times a while back. These slides are coming from David Otter's talk at last year's AEA meetings. What this slide shows us is hourly wage of different types of workers. The gray points here are hourly wages for college-educated workers in cities of different densities. So in layman's terms, these are small places, these are large places, and each panel here corresponds to a different period. So in 1950, there was a pretty significant urban wage premium in the sense that wages were higher for college-educated workers in bigger places, and wages were also higher for non-college educated workers in larger places. But as we shift forward in time, 30 years to 1980, this lower curve for non-college workers looks like it might have flattened just a bit. It's flattened noticeably by 2000, and it's almost entirely flat by 2015, whereas the slope for college-educated workers has stayed the same. So what this means is that the urban wage premium has stayed intact for more educated workers, but has mostly disappeared for less educated workers. And if you take into account housing costs, the way Jed Kolko has in one of his studies at Indeed, this is actually downward sloping once you take those costs into account. What are the reasons for this? Why is this happening? Is a great way of dovetailing into Morris's presentation.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, good morning. It's great to be up this early and talking about housing prices and mobility and wealth. Did everyone enjoy the vegetable samosa? Yeah, it was great, right? My name is Morris Davis. I work at Rutgers. And yesterday there was a lot of talk about supply. And today I want to talk a little bit about demand. And I'm going to talk in terms that are entirely too simplistic, because I want to talk about underlying forces that I believe are deep in causing what I believe is an affordability crisis. So here's a bird's eye perspective of what we can call the housing affordability crisis. So first, housing affordability is what macroeconomists would call an equilibrium phenomenon. Just because a landlord posts a high rental price doesn't mean somebody has to pay it. So rental prices that you observe are an agreement between both landlords and tenants. And so owners decide, or landlords decide how much they want to charge, and renters decide where to live and how much they want to pay. The question for us is, why are renters willing to pay this? Why are renters willing to pay so much when there are places out there that are cheap in the United States? And now, another point I want to talk through today is housing affordability. We heard a lot about Portland and Minneapolis and other places, Baltimore. But what we've learned when you talk to people worldwide is that what's called the housing affordability crisis, it's a worldwide phenomenon. Talk to people that live in Sydney, Australia, or in London, England, or in Vancouver or Toronto, or talk to enough people, Madrid, and all of a sudden the same things, the same themes that we were talking about yesterday pop up in their countries as well. So we'd want a story that would fit not just the pattern, the fact pattern in the United States, but also worldwide. And the fact pattern that I'm going to hypothesize is that we have a housing affordability crisis because of trends in productivity, the nature of production and employment, and then finally this concept that's called the worldwide savings glut. If you want to be have a more sharp term to it, you could say China's purchases of assets. So the productivity story, what am I talking about? So I'm borrowing a, what's the right word? A parable, I guess, from Paul Krugman. Imagine a world in which there are only two goods, hot dogs and hot dog buns. So every hot dog needs a hot dog bun. Now, suppose then productivity growth, there's two sectors in this world, hot dog firms and hot dog bun firms. So suppose productivity growth is faster for the hot dog firms than the bun firms. What happens? Well, all of a sudden you have all these hot dogs piling up and not enough buns. So the price of hot dogs relative to buns is going to fall. But all these extra hot dogs can't be consumed without buns. So what has to happen? Employees have to shift from the hot dog sector to the bun sector so that we get the right mix of hot dogs and buns. So what you predict is that prices of hot dogs will fall, and then the number of hot dog bun employees increases. Okay, so that's Paul Krugman's story from Slate from 1990. And what he did, and what I'm going to do today, is just replace the words hot dog with manufacturing and the words buns with services. So let's just look at some data. Manufacturing productivity versus just overall productivity between 1950 and 2019. So according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, manufacturing productivity was 2.7% per year over this entire period. Productivity of the entire non-farm business economy, so you don't include the government, but the entire non-farm, don't include farms, just everything, was 2.2%, and that includes manufacturing. So it means the other sectors of the economy, not including manufacturing, had slower productivity growth. Now, most of the other sectors of the economy is just services. So manufacturing productivity growth, great. Services productivity growth, low. Then you could say, okay, what's happened to employment? So this table here shows employment of manufacturing, and I've lumped together manufacturing and construction, which is unfair because anyone that studies construction productivity knows it's really low. We're having an addition done to our house, and they're like still measuring things with rulers and cutting things with saws. And you're like, didn't we do that in 1950? So I don't think there's been that much growth in construction services, and it shows up if you get an addition done to your house. But for the purposes of this table, I lumped those two groups together. So in the end of the 1950s, there were 20 million manufacturing workers, and roughly speaking, that was 40% of employment. And there are 26 million workers in services, which includes transportation and other things. But let's just call it services, and that was 54% of employment. Now fast forward to the recent period. There's still 20 million workers in manufacturing. That's 15% of employment. And now there's 105 million workers in services, 83% of employment. So okay, that's nice. What should that do? Why am I drawing this link between housing affordability and what's going on in productivity? There's a phenomenon called agglomeration that's very real. And the best way to explain it is, how many of you have ever shopped for a car? I realize it's not trendy to say you own a car. You say you Uber or get a Lyft or hitchhike or whatever the kids do these days. But some of you probably shop for a car, How many of you noticed that if you go to one car store, there's plenty of the others around? It's clustering. The reason they do that is they know if you're shopping for a car, you might just drive next door to look for a different brand. It's the same reason there's shopping malls. People know that if you've taken the effort to go to the mall to buy shoes, you might need pants. So they cluster stores together. That's one reason Amazon is so big. Amazon takes the natural agglomeration forces with shopping and basically exploits it. Do all of your shopping for everything in one place. So we know on the consumption side that industries cluster, but it's true on the production side. So in the old days, when you built a manufacturing plant, you could basically build it anywhere. Like, why does Akron, Ohio have Goodyear? It's because it was by the lakes, I guess, and they had access to material cheaply via water transportation. But can you imagine, was there any possibility that HQ2 for Amazon showed up in Akron, Ohio? No, so what's happened is that the forces of agglomeration and of clustering appear to be, again, I don't have great research to back this up. I'm doing a little off the cuff talking here, but I believe the forces of agglomeration are much more important in high tech than in manufacturing. But either way, let's just say industries cluster. So in where were the manufacturing cities? Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee. Where are the services cities? Or you could say the high-tech cities. Boston, Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco. So the reason we have basically a housing affordability crisis in Boston, LA, New York, San Francisco, and other places, that just happens to be where tech and services are, and those are the industries that are gaining employment because of productivity shifts. That's simplified, but that's my best guess. Anyway, where are renters willing to pay more? If you're a renter, you're willing to pay more in places with more employment opportunities. So a deep question in urban economics then is, okay, we know that there are cheap places out there like Milwaukee. Why don't they just create high-tech clusters? And then you'd figure people that are paying 60% of their income to live in San Francisco, or those employees that live in a trailer and work in Google or whatever those stories are, why don't they just move to Milwaukee? The answer is it's basically hard, if not impossible, to create a high-tech cluster. Everyone's trying, and very few cities are actually able to do it. So Pittsburgh has reinvented itself successfully, I think. But it's very hard to do. Otherwise, more cities would do it. Okay. So why do I mention this? What I'm talking about, productivity changes, clustering, those are global, worldwide forces. And so I think this story fits many global and historical facts. One fact people don't know is that house prices started to rise pretty rapidly after 1950 worldwide. And that's consistent with a shift in production from manufacturing to services. So what kept house prices relatively low? Again, more off the cuff, but innovations and investment in transportation helped add feasible supply. So the road network of the 50s was a huge land supply shock that helped bring prices down for a long time. So now the questions we have to ask are we out of easily developable land given our existing infrastructure system? And are agglomeration forces truly larger than... So I have this, there's some clustering that happens at the industry level. And then there's financial services. So you have New York, but New York's not alone. You could go to Charlotte, and now you have high tech. So successively, it appears as if agglomeration's getting stronger in the way that we produce. And then there's an accelerating force, which is that foreigners are buying units and then keeping them vacant. So how do we get out of this? Here's a prediction which no one's going to like. I think the affordability problem is going to get worse. Because there's no evidence that we have that any of these forces that I've mentioned, if they're working as we think they are going to change. The one way you could say is, well, all we need to do is create new high-tech clusters to sort of redistribute employment. It's just apparently almost impossible to do that. It's happened in Austin, it's happening in Pittsburgh. You could talk about Nashville if you like to. Every college town's trying to build a high-tech center. It's just, we haven't seen it be successful. And Minneapolis is a little bit lucky. Like Minneapolis and Milwaukee used to be roughly the same income. Minneapolis is much richer now. It's because Milwaukee was more manufacturing, and Milwaukee had all of these services with Costco and Best Buy and 3M that Milwaukee didn't have. I would still say, I guess Minneapolis has some tech, but I don't think of it as a tech cluster place. So, frankly, I don't think relative to San Francisco, Minneapolis has much to worry about. I'm glad to see Minneapolis is being very thoughtful about its zoning, but it's not San Francisco. I don't project it will be. So let's put it this way, except for what we saw yesterday, existing methods to create new housing supply are very difficult. Can we increase the density of existing development? That requires some political will. That's very challenging. And one thing I'd say is our existing infrastructure at capacity. In New York, it might be. Have any of you visited New York on Thanksgiving? It's kind of awful. So this is a true story. We thought we were going to Radio City Music Hall to see the Rockettes. Am I out of time? I've got only 1 minute? Okay. You guys will love this story, and you'll tell it to your kids, too. So we thought, what a great evening. We'll go see the Rockettes at Radio City Music Hall. We'll take the train in. Train's at Penn Station. Radio City Music Hall's, I don't know, a mile away by foot. And it was early November. Weather was lovely. We get out of Penn Station. All we had to do is walk a mile. And every square inch of infrastructure was occupied by either a car or a human being. So the sidewalks are pretty wide. Imagine a sidewalk, roughly speaking, half the width of this room, maybe 2/3 of the width of this room, where every single inch of sidewalk is occupied by a person. So it's like stampede conditions. Imagine a road where every single inch of asphalt is covered by a car, so that the police with their sirens on can't get anywhere. Imagine a subway where every single car is completely packed. So people that want to add density to Manhattan are nuts. So we have to expand our infrastructure to add density, and it's not clear how you do it. It's very expensive. So finally, okay, so what can we do? That was not a cheap shot at Jenny, and I apologize to Jenny in advance. Jenny is going to tell us why our cities have to be more green and more dense, and that's absolutely true, except for New York.
New York has Central Park.
It's true, we could develop Central Park. I'm sorry. Maybe Jenny wasn't going to say that. Okay, so what can we do to increase the supply of housing? And actually, I think driverless cars is going to create actually more sprawl. And then we could talk about other experimental transportation. But I don't see a way out of this, what we're seeing, because of these fundamental demand forces. So that's my talk. Sorry for the rambling. Thanks very much.
I apologize for not being there, and I have so far this morning thoroughly enjoyed the presentations. So thank you again for the invitation to be part of this, expanding and diversifying housing approaches and impacts on opportunity, and particularly this panel on impacts of housing access on individual and community outcomes. The questions that are before us, I believe, and if you could move forward one slide, are access to housing, how has it shifted over time? And I believe it's very clear to all participants it has, and it's not a temporary phenomenon. And what are the socioeconomic drivers of this long-term trend and the consequences of this long-term trend? I just want, can we move ahead? Can you still hear me okay? Are we good?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. So what we're looking at in the data here are for the United States as a whole. So it's including rural areas, which, as you'll see in a moment, are very different outcomes and very different prospects. So if we were to look only at the metropolitan areas of the U.S., these trends would be far stronger. And if we looked at the growing metros, and as we heard from Morris and Issi, there is a divergence, the great divergence. Again, the disparities would be much deeper. But nonetheless, I wanted to show this for the United States as a whole. And what does it show? On the left, or on my left, where we have the orange, the light blue and orange, and the gray. Gray is income, median income. The orange is median rent, and the blue is median value. From 2000 to 2014, in every region, the median value and median rent have grown faster than median income. Less so for the Midwest. It's the moderate of these four regions, but nonetheless, very, very consistent across the Northeast, South, and West. On the right, this is mislabeled. It's only update from 2014 to 2018. We see there's some moderation in housing prices, although there's certainly not enough moderation to make it more affordable. But rents continue from 2000 to 2018 to exceed, median rent continues to exceed median income. In fact, median value of housing and rents are almost twice as high as median income growth. Going to the next slide, please. That is since 2000. And the next slide shows decline in interstate mobility, but this goes back to the 1950s. From 1950 to the mid-1970s, there's very little change in mobility. It's about 20%. 1 in 5 households moved every year. And they moved to opportunity. They moved to the south and west where the jobs were, where the higher wage jobs were. Starting in the late 1980s, but accelerating after 2000, we have a decline from 20% to 11%, almost half in our national mobility rates, and it's almost entirely driven by interstate. Let's turn back to the housing cost story, because I believe the housing cost, which includes both rent and ownership costs, by employment growth, explains the 2000 on decline in mobility. This is consistent with Issi's charts, and it's also consistent with Morris's presentation and his explanation of the shift in the structure, the economic structure of the United States and the global structure to a service from manufacturing to technology and to the increased importance of agglomeration, and therefore cities where agglomeration is occurring. So what do we see here is housing cost relative to income, and we divide up the United States now into areas, metro areas, with job growth, higher than average, higher than median rather. That's the blue lines. So the blue lines, what we're showing here are house value and rent. Blue is house value, and the red is rent for different periods of time. So rent and house values for different periods of time, but we're dividing it up between above median and below median. And the blue is above median and the red is below median. And you can see in every single case that house prices and rents, values and rents, have exceeded the growth rates in high employment as opposed to low employment growth areas. Of course, that's very reasonable. That's what we would expect. However, it's not what characterized the United States historically. Historically, rents and house prices corrected for inflation through 2000, or the late 1990s, mid-1990s, depending on where you pick up the beginning of the trend, were flat, adjusted for inflation. This is a point I make to my students, and they're astonished. But it's true that housing prices in the U.S. basically, quality adjusted, inflation adjusted, did not rise on average across the country, which means that housing was basically affordable. Even in the growing regions, even in the regions with high employment, rents and housing prices did not increase starting in the 1990s. It did on the coast, and that phenomenon of higher housing price growth and higher rental growth is now not just coastal, it's across the country. And while obviously Issi's numbers are completely correct, I do want to make the point that Texas, for example, which has had very elastic supply, which again characterized the U.S. through late 1980s, Texas continued to have very elastic housing supply, but now the growing metros of Texas, Houston, Dallas, Austin, Fort Worth, are in fact showing price and rent rises, which show that even in these areas of very high employment growth, housing supply is not keeping up. But there are areas in the U.S., next slide please. In fact, most of the U.S., 80% of the counties of the U.S. are seeing a decline in jobs and a decline in the number of residents, as this shows. This is the great sorting, the great resorting, the great divergence. And there is a movement to cities and to bigger cities, but not for everyone. And what bigger cities? Well, this I'm taking from Jed Kolko. I know you heard yesterday. The cities are now increasingly tech-driven, and it's six of the, if I want to go back for a moment, I actually would like to go back a slide or two, if I may, and actually going back to slide number 5. And if you can't do this, you see, I'm just going to read it. In 1980, this makes the point of the supply elasticity shift. In 1980, the 10 largest cities, housing prices were a little bit under $200,000 today in today's dollars, only 25% above the national average. So the top 10 cities by house price, on average, had housing prices only 25% above the national average. Today, the top 10 cities' housing prices are 3 times the national average at $600,000. So something different is upon us. And what I believe, I'm now back to slide 8, Issi, thank you. What I believe is happening is on the supply side and the demand side, and I think we've heard from previous speakers going to both. On the supply side, there is a tightening of zoning and land use controls, and we have an index that Wharton collects, and we just have the new index, which shows that there is a tightening restrictions across the country, including in Texas and in the South. And in addition, there is a demand side, which is a movement to the cities where the supply is most restricted and where densification is most difficult, in part because they are already dense. So, but what does this mean for mobility, and particularly let's take mobility of a low-skilled worker? I am now on slide 8, and the end result is that people with less education are effectively pushed out of larger cities. They're locked out. So let's take the perspective of a low-wage earner, a janitor, who's in the Deep South in 1960, and their earnings are $14,000. They move to Santa Clara, and their earnings almost double, $29,000. Now, that's after, these are earnings after housing costs. Today, in the Deep South, after housing costs, the earnings would be $19,000. Moving to Santa Clara, their earnings would drop to $14,000, a negative $5,000. They won't do it, which explains not just the janitor, but increasingly middle-skilled workers not moving to our high-price, growing prosperity tech centers. What are the consequences? Next slide. I believe the consequences are intergenerational, and therefore it's extraordinarily important that we increase access to opportunity and access to housing in growing metropolitan areas. So the consequences are, first, and this is where the slide is on homeownership. Homeownership is down, but particularly down for minorities. Black households are actually at 50-year lows. This only goes back to 1994, but in the paper that we have recently done, we show it's at 50-year lows. And also for young households on the right, that's the red line, under 35, but also 35 to 44. In fact, the 35 to 44-year-olds are now under 60, or slightly under 60%, from as high as 70% in past years. These lows do not account for the increasing number of households that are double, triple, and with younger households, particularly through 35, living at home. Why does this matter? It matters in part for intergenerational transfers. So if you do not become a homeowner, historically only about 10% of our population have never homeowners, but it's possible that in the coming decades we'll see that rise substantially. We have a paper entitled Renter versus Homeowner Nation. We in the U.S. are obviously a homeowner nation, but our peers are not necessarily. So Germany, for example, has only 40% homeownership. And trends in terms of access to homeownership, if we became a nation of California, we would be a renter nation, with consequences for intergenerational transfer of wealth. And then finally, the other opportunity, it's not just about building wealth, obviously, capital, and homeownership is all about building wealth. That's where most people's wealth is built. But it's also about opportunity in childhood. And increasingly, with the big divergence, there is parents are unable to move to metros with growth opportunity, and the older intrametropolitan sorting has remained and is increasing, where children in poverty are more concentrated than previously, and Rod Shetty's work, of course, shows the long-term consequences of that. So, in summary, access to locations with high productivity jobs is increasingly limited by regional housing affordability barriers. Areas from which lower-income households are increasingly priced out are also more likely to have higher levels of intergenerational mobility. Access to opportunity continues to be challenged within metropolitan areas as the gentrifications of downtowns is accompanied by an increase in concentrated poverty in inner ring suburbs and inner outlying city neighborhoods. And these trends on both the regional and local scales derive from the increased importance of place in the knowledge-based economy of today. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. In the interest of time, I'm going to limit the discussion now to just 3 questions that we have here. I think what we've talked about so far mostly concerns people's access to opportunity across different metro areas. And that mostly speaks to people's job and employment opportunities more than it does to individual opportunities. Those depend a lot on people's choice of neighborhoods. So the picture I think we've painted is that part of the population is locked out of those superstar cities, which seem to be where opportunity is concentrated. It's harder to migrate from the cheaper parts of the country to the more expensive parts of the country as the price divergence between the two grows. And the set of people who are able to stay in the superstar cities is not that stable, in the sense that a lot of people who grew up there are being priced out, and people who move there at a young age are also eventually priced out. So my first question to Morris and to Susan, who's hopefully still on the line.
I am, thank you.
Would shifting everyone into the superstar cities solve our problem? Is the right solution, at least in theory, to say let's close up Appalachia and let's close up the Rust Belt and just shift many millions of people to live in the expensive coastal cities?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, that way you can clean up my mess.
I can learn.
So that's a difficult question. I think the fundamental question we want to ask is, what do we want to achieve through a place-based policy? So if the idea is we want to maximize GDP, then we want to put people in the most productive places. If the idea is we want to maximize human happiness, then we have to ask, why are people unhappy now? And do they know that they're unhappy? So, and that we heard a lot about that last night. There's a lot of very talented people in this country that don't receive the appropriate level of investment. That could be in elementary schools. Their schools could be no good. Their peers could be bad role models. That could be at college. Maybe they didn't have enough money or the ability to borrow to go, or maybe when they did go, they had to take a 2-year degree rather than a 4-year degree. So we've left a lot of human capital investment on the table. And I guess a question would be, if we're literally talking about investing in people that have been underinvested in historically, take Appalachia. Do we move people out of Appalachia, put them in San Francisco, and then get them exposure to what the new knowledge economy looks like? Or do we simply add more resources to Appalachia to make sure that their human capital is maximized? That's a very difficult question. Probably both.
Yeah, so I agree, probably both. And it's a very important question. And of course, it's not we, it's markets and individuals, but there is a policy component. And I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy because clearly there is a great need in California for more affordable housing now, and the coast in general, coastal cities in general. How that gets accomplished and the trade-offs obviously are being right now hotly debated. But it's not as though there isn't job growth in the Midwest. There is job growth in the Midwest. And in fact, as Issi, you know so well, the largest cities now are losing population as they're moving to more affordable cities, which are still not that affordable. But nonetheless, the question is whether these second-tier cities, the Nashvilles, let's say, the Orlandos, the Columbus, Ohio, whether they will be able to capture gains associated with growth in population and achieve agglomeration economies, or in fact is the new economy, the knowledge economy, such that the top 10 cities, the top 6 cities, the tech cities they have the magic of that agglomeration, and we will, in order for the continued growth of the United States, have to make more housing available, as well as for equity in these cities.
Thank you. So thinking about the dichotomy between expanding GDP, making people better off in the sense of allowing them to earn more, and making people happier as our goal. It seems to me from the answers I heard that making people happier involves people to a larger extent staying where they are. What is it that makes people stay put in locations that seem to have, at least superficially, disadvantages in terms of their opportunities career-wise?
So if you'd like, I'll start that one. Clearly, housing costs are a large portion of this, and I know from very good work that's done by Morris, it's not the entire story, and he, in his work, may come up with different shares of this. But housing affordability is newly a factor in mobility, where it hasn't been historically in the U.S. So that's one. But secondly, Raj Chetty's work shows that there is opportunity, that even the work on moving to opportunity, that households maybe just really don't know their options or find it very difficult to take advantage of options in moving and find it very difficult to move. So one of the suggested policies going forward is, this comes out of Chetty's work, is that house choice vouchers, for example, come with counseling to take advantage of better neighborhoods for particularly for children.
So that's all great. I'm just going to have a small follow-up. One reason it's hard for cities to see net flows is that gross flows are really large. I think gross flows are like 10 times the order of net flows. So if a city loses 10,000 people, they might have had 50,000 people move in or 50,000 people move out and 40,000 people move in. That's 5 times. But so it's hard to actually, so then the question is, wait, why are there so many people moving into Detroit? For a while, Detroit lost a lot of population on net, but there were flows, huge flows in both directions. And this gets back to why do people move in general. Sometimes it's employment opportunities, so you can get a great job in a bad location. A lot of times it's home. People just want to go home. And then a lot of times there's health shocks, there's divorce shocks, and retirement. So people move for all kinds of reasons. And I think this is what makes it's hard to see the trend when there's so much noise around the trend. And I think that's something that we're getting better at explaining to policymakers. Just because a good firm moved in, there were 2 good firms that left. So the net's negative, even though there's still some positive action.
On a related note, is moving even the good solution that we think it is in terms of people's opportunities, even just in the narrow career view? What I'd like to ask here is this: there's a difference between different metros in terms of the employment opportunities that they open up today. There's also a lot of difference across different parts of each metro. The different neighborhoods within a metro also matter a lot. So my question to you is, what's more important? Are the differences between metros much larger than the difference between neighborhoods within a metro, or do those differences hyperlocally actually matter a lot more than which metro you're in?
Susan, you want me to go first?
Go ahead.
So 2 things. First, moving's really hard. I'm not going to answer a different question. Moving's really hard. So here's the story. We moved from Wisconsin to New Jersey in 2015, and my kids cried every day for 9 months. So, I don't know how you put a dollar value on that. We did. I moved and took away a raise, but the kids were crying. So moving is difficult. Second, I think it depends what metric you're looking at, but I think for many of the outcomes that we think matter, differences within metros are actually much larger than differences across metros. So like there's going to be places in Detroit, the Detroit metro area, where the high school graduation rate's nearly 100%, there's no teen pregnancies, there's no child mortality. And in the same metro area, there's going to be high schools where there's graduation rates 30%, there's a teen pregnancy problem, there's lots of drugs, violence, alcohol. So that's why I think the moving to opportunity experiment was so important. The question is, if you just move people out of bad places within a metro area, how much change benefit can you possibly expect to see? Susan?
Yes, another really important question, and I agree with Morris that actually it's within metro that is perhaps the more extreme in terms of one neighborhood to another. But I think the trends that we were talking about earlier on the cross-metro, inter-metro trends are also having impact within metros locally. So let me expand on that for a moment. Through 2000, from 1970 through 2000, 2/3 of our major cities were losing population, and housing prices were falling. So we're talking about cities like Atlanta, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Boston, Washington. These were very affordable cities until they turned around in around 2000. Big turnaround, big divergence. So now what's happening in these cities is that downtowns are revitalizing, they're gentrifying, and housing prices are increasing. So there are neighborhoods after neighborhoods that are becoming high quality and very expensive. So what does this do to the households who need to be at home, live in their city? So it's not a question of either or. The major trends that are affecting our economy are affecting metros and neighborhoods.
I think this would be a good point to bring Sandy into the conversation. Sandy, I could see you shaking your head. I don't know if the audience can see you, but I could see you shaking your head as I asked about whether differences between metros or within metros are more important in this respect. Do you want to say anything to that before you give your presentation?
Are you speaking to me?
I am. I am. Could you?
Okay. I've been listening in. This has been very fascinating. Since I come from the perspective of the individual and the family, through the research that I'm familiar with, sometimes the change in neighborhood is so dramatic and so jarring to the family that it probably, as an experience, is not all that different from a move across metros. And I think, as has been mentioned, the large majority of moves that families make are within the metro area, and that move itself is a pretty significant life event. So if we look at the evidence from Moving to Opportunity or the Welfare to Work voucher or any of the other experimental or quasi-experimental studies, one of the things that rings home is that the move itself is a very dramatic event for the family, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. And a large fraction of the families who move to opportunity, so to speak, actually move back to their original neighborhood.
Is the takeaway from this that we should avoid moves as part of our solutions and focus on place-based policies?
Oh, absolutely not. But brings true something that Susan said earlier, which is that information deficiencies loom very large, and we need to think much harder about how to disseminate information in a friendly way that helps individuals and families understand what their options are, what kind of assistance is available, and other elements that they might want to take into account in making decisions.
Got it. I think this would be a great point to hear your presentation.
Okay, thank you. And my apologies to the audience. This is a challenging panel. I'm afraid that the trade-off that was made here is that you're getting me, but you're not getting my slides. So I'm hoping that I can walk you through some ideas here without the benefit of having you see the slides. So I'm going to shift the focus now to look at effects on children in particular, but also adults in one the data that we used for most of these studies. We looked at multiple waves of the panel study of income dynamics, which is now 5 decades old, following families over all of that time. We've linked that data to census data, to HUD administrative data on assisted housing programs, and to multiple other data sources. So this is a very rich source of information to look at family and children experiences over time. I'll talk about a few health outcomes, and for that research, we've used the newly created linked data between the National Health Interview Survey, which is the main source of health information on the population. This has been linked to HUD administrative data on assisted housing. In all of these studies, we've used a quasi-experimental approach. One of the persistent, omnipresent problems when you're analyzing survey data is selection bias and omitted variable bias, and it's just a burden, but we've tried to find ways in these studies to deal with those problems so that we hope we're coming close to looking at causal effects. So the first study I want to talk about is the link between housing affordability and healthy child development. Not that this audience needs much motivation for why one would look at this, but basically we view housing affordability as the main housing problem facing families. It affects more than 70% of low and moderate income families that have children. So the question is, how might housing affordability affect children's healthy development? And we're particularly interested here in children's cognitive development, which includes reading ability, math ability, and so on. So one view is what I'll call the conventional view. And this theory essentially says that when you're living in unaffordable housing, this reduces the discretionary income you have to pay for other items. This includes both necessities as well as investments in enrichment for your children. What I'll call the unconventional view sort of flips this around, and it says if you have a low-income family that is spending too low a fraction of their income on housing, they're likely to be living in poor housing conditions and in a poor neighborhood, and this too might have very significant effects on children's cognitive development. And then third, it may be the case that both of these views is correct, and if that is the case, then what you would expect to see when you plot children's cognitive scores on the y-axis, I'm afraid you can't see the graph, and housing cost burden, the affordability of the family on the x-axis, you'd see an inverted U, which would show you that cognitive scores are lowest for the poor families that are spending a low fraction of their income on housing, and at the higher end where families are spending a significant fraction of their income on housing. And if the typical rule of thumb about what we consider affordable housing is the 30% standard, then you might expect that the peak of this inverted U would be right around the 30%. I'm really sorry that you can't see my beautiful graph, which essentially shows that when we analyze the data, this is in fact what we see. It is an inverted U, and the inflection point is right around the 30%. So we didn't stop there. The next question is really the hard question, which is what's the mechanism at work here? Why is it that housing affordability would in fact have a measurable effect on children's cognitive development? And to understand this better, we dove into another data set called the Consumer Expenditure Surveys, which collects myriad expenditures of a large sample of US households. And we coded up all of the expenditures on children. And when we took a look at that, what we found was that families that spent a significantly higher amount on enrichment for their children were the families where the child's cognitive development was greatest. We did not find that relationship for necessities, and we believe that's the case because for low-income families, the social safety net is doing, by and large, a good job. So jumping from this first study, let me tell you about a second study, and here we shift to the assisted housing programs, public housing, multifamily housing, and vouchers, and child development. And the motivation here is that we have more than 4 million children living in these assisted housing environments. We're spending more than about $40 billion on assisted housing programs. So here we expand beyond cognitive performance and include also socio-emotional adjustment of children. These are behavior problems that children might have. And we ask again, how is it that we might see a relationship between assisted housing and these two measures of healthy child development? So first, let me take on affordability. We just saw that there is a relationship when we look at the full housing market between affordability and at least cognitive development. So we think that might be at work here because assisted housing, by and large, is by law and regulation providing affordable housing to families. A second is that assisted housing by regulation, should provide standard and decent housing for families to live in. This is because they have housing quality standards and must be inspected on a regular basis. This is not what happens in the private market at all. And let me mention that these effects could be direct or indirect. So in the case of housing quality, if a child is living in hazardous conditions and they have a severe injury, this clearly is going to directly affect their cognitive development and perhaps socio-emotional behavior. But it also could operate indirectly because these environments could have strong effects on children's parents, for example. And if they are more stressed or less stressed by these conditions, that could affect their parenting, and parenting has a direct effect on children. And finally, there's the question of neighborhood effects, which has gotten a lot of attention. I believe that here the jury is out. It's really uncertain what the effects will be. When we look at neighborhood effects, we typically look at how affluent areas or higher income areas will affect children. And there are two competing theories. One theory is called collective socialization, which essentially says that children will model their behavior after the role models that they see, both adults and also their peers. And so living in a higher income area would have a beneficial effect on them. And therefore, since assisted housing is primarily not in higher income areas, it should have a negative effect. But there's a competing theory called relative deprivation, which says that when children are living in these higher income areas and they themselves are from low income families, they compare their, what their family has relative to the other families around them, and they feel that they can't compete in these environments, and so they essentially give up. So you have these two competing theories. There's an interesting side note added by some work by Jean Brooks-Gunn and her colleagues on the collective socialization theory that says that for a black male youth, collective socialization, seeing adult role models, only seems to have a positive effect when those role models are black as well. So what do we find here? Well, like many of our colleagues, when we looked at assisted housing across the board for the average child, we found no beneficial effects on either cognitive development or on socio-emotional adjustment. But we took the next step and we said, well, maybe there are some subgroups for whom assisted housing actually is working out better. And in fact, that's what we found. So we found that assisted housing actually is a boost to children who have the highest cognitive performance and the best socio-emotional adjustment. And by contrast, it has the most negative effect on children who start out with poor cognitive performance and poor socio-emotional adjustment. We found no evidence that either the housing conditions or the neighborhood conditions played any role here. And so this leaves affordability essentially on the table, and we're continuing to pursue that in future work. A third and sort of quick summary on this study, this is the effect of assisted housing or its relationship to health outcomes for children. Here is where we did use this link between the National Health Interview Survey and HUD administrative data. Up until the point at which this link had been done, it was almost impossible to study health effects of assisted housing. So in two papers, first paper we found that public housing in particular, and we did look at different programs, so public, multifamily, and vouchers. Public housing actually had the strongest positive relationship with children's mental health. And in a second study, we looked at children with asthma and the emergency room visits that a child with asthma makes over a period of time. And we found that those were 25% lower among children who lived in public or multifamily housing compared to our quasi wait list group. This is families who were going to enter assisted housing within 2 or more years of our panel. Asthma-related emergency room visits cost Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program $272 million a year. They're more than $400 a visit, and so this would be a significant savings. In a final study, we're very intrigued, as many have been, by the tumultuous economy of the 2000 decade. And we wanted to look at whether there were significant differences in wealth accumulation of Black and white first-time home buyers during that volatile period, and if, in fact, we saw those big differences, what seemed to explain them. Well, not surprisingly, we did find dramatic differences for Black and white first-time home buyers. For whites, the timing factor was critical, so timing is everything here. If the purchase was made as the market was moving up, then there were gains. If the purchase was made right at the point of entering the Great Recession, then there were losses. So this was a timing issue. For Blacks, there were losses regardless of timing over the decade. And when we dug deeper, this appears to be driven largely by location. These Black purchasers purchased their homes in more distressed neighborhoods that had lower levels of home ownership, that had much lower housing prices, that were racially segregated. And so I hope that the slides will be available to you. I have links to all of the papers, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
So we are coming towards the end of this panel, so I'm going to ask you one quick question, Sandy, and then open it up to the audience's questions. If you could list your wish list of outcomes that we ought to care about, ignoring limitations on what we can actually observe, what do you think housing actually affects that we should be interested in, and what of that can we actually observe?
Okay, I think I heard what's my wish list of outcomes that we should look at. I don't know if there was anything else in that question.
The only addition is, once you have that list, what of that can we actually have a hope of observing?
Okay, so I mean, my wish list is very long, but my work has been primarily focused on children, so I would say that on the child wish list, I do include cognitive development, socio-emotional, or some people refer to that as non-cognitive. It really is not non-cognitive, but sort of behaviors of kids, and also health. These are 3 very prominent features. For adults, much of the work has focused really on economic outcomes, income, wages, employment, work hours, educational attainment. Those deserve to be on the list. I think they're very important. In terms of what we can actually study, I'm glad you asked me this question. So there's been some very, very interesting work by a young economist, Eric Chin, who's at Dartmouth. I won't go into the details of his study, but what his study essentially shows us is that when you run an experiment, such as the Moving to Opportunity experiment, ethical obligations require that we ask people to volunteer to participate in the experiment. And in MTO, only 25% of those inner city public housing residents volunteered for the program. What Chin's work shows us is that there is negative selection going on, and those who volunteered are not the ones who stand to benefit the most from the intervention. It's rather those who don't volunteer that are the group that would benefit the most. And so we now have a new major random controlled trial that HUD is going to be doing on moving to opportunity. I am very concerned about this particular aspect of the design. I'm not sure I can figure out at the moment a way around it, but I think we need to have our eyes open about the potential effects of this negative selection.
Let's take a couple questions in the time we have left. It's going to be important that whoever asks speaks in the microphone so Sandy can hear us as well.
Last night's speaker mentioned Nicole Hannah-Jones. I'm a devotee of the podcast from the New York Times called The Daily, and she did an episode this summer that I found totally arresting. If memory serves, the title was something or other like "The Myth That Busing Failed." I'm wondering if you, the single most arresting statement out of this amazing episode was that I'm going to have a hard time getting her wording exactly right, but the thought was roughly that if you want, there's no magic in putting black children together with white children, that what closes the achievement gap is if you want black students to have access to the same resources in the classroom that white students have access to, black students need to be in the same classroom with the white students. And she told an amazing story from Charlotte, where the way that they knew that busing was coming was in the historically African-American school. All of a sudden, workers were installing updated lab equipment and providing the textbooks that the school should have had all along. So we haven't heard about busing. It seems like an alternative approach in the toolkit, or a part of the toolkit portfolio. I just love to hear the panelists' reflections on busing as part of the portfolio of tools.
Sandy, you're probably the closest to this. Sandy, could you hear the question?
I did hear the question.
Okay.
What I want to alert the questioner to very new research that's just come out from Sean Reardon, who is at Stanford University. And I just read the paper, so I don't want to, I may be misstating this, but he's done a very, very careful analysis of black children's performance in school and segregation and so on. And what he found was the most important explanation for the disparity between blacks and whites was the resources that the school had available. And that black children typically ended up in under-resourced schools compared to white children. And so I would advise that we take a look at that very carefully. But there's been a lot of, how much of this is being with white children as opposed to being in schools that are highly resourced, I think is still a question.
Mic on? David, can I take a stab at answering this? I think the underlying theme to your question is, do we need vouchers to move people across neighborhoods if we have buses that can move kids across schools? And what I can tell you is, based on my own research, I think these neighborhood effects that Chetty et al. Document, and I have some work that talks about it, is bigger than just what school are you in. Because you can actually look at Los Angeles. Los Angeles has maps of census tracts, and you can map for each census tract what the quality is as measured by the Los Angeles school system of the local public elementary school. And then you can ask how well do those maps correlate with estimates of value added that are from other sources. And the correlation's not great. So there's probably something else to a neighborhood than a school that makes a neighborhood a great place.
That's a great answer. Do we have time for one more question? Let's take one more.
Yeah, so I'm glad that productivity, migration, a lot of new themes got brought into the conversation today. It makes me wonder how to connect a whole other body of research that looks at productivity, of workers, local economic productivity as increasing with both urban density and with average education level. Is there a sense in which, like, in a contrarian way, we should think of there being a certain kind of positive spillover from supply constraints if essentially constraining housing supply both sort of pushes up density in the absence of sort of spreading out, and because of migration, ends up pushing up average educational attainment? You know, is there this weird, unexpected positive spillover, which in turn boosts productivity in constrained places, and it could be a reinforcing cycle around polarization?
Can I take a stab at that? Sure. So Jed, so by the way, the typical answer is, why do we live in cities? We live in cities because there's obvious economic benefits from us living close together. And so that's what people call agglomeration. That shows up both on the consumption side, which is why we have shopping malls, and it shows up in production, which is why industries cluster together. So what Jed's question is, okay, so if we stuff people together, are we going to get even greater productivity benefits? And so through density and agglomeration. So the standard estimate is that if you double a city's density, wages per capita increase by about 2%. So that's, in my opinion, that's not enough to bridge the gap between the average wage in San Jose and, say, the average wage in Milwaukee.
So I don't know that I have an answer to your full question, but I do think that there is some confusion or lack of distinction between density, physical density, living in walkable places, working in walkable places as a driver of agglomeration forces, and simply having a large number of people within a certain time distance of each other. And one way to make this clear is, or asking this differently, is our agglomeration forces stronger in San Francisco, where people are physically close together, compared to what they are in Silicon Valley, where people are not close together in the physical walking sense, but they are close together in the sense that they can meet a certain number of colleagues within X minutes of driving. I think there is an extremely broad set of distinct models that explain how agglomeration works, and there's been a lot less work than I would have hoped to see trying to distinguish which of those agglomeration mechanisms actually matter more. My intuition is that mechanisms that involve the labor market, the depth of the pool, and the ability to tap a deeper pool of labor are probably much more important than knowledge spillovers of the type that happen on the sidewalk or at the cafe or at the bar that I know Ed Glazer likes to emphasize. So that's just my personal bent, but that would, if my intuition is right, that would suggest that it's not physical density per se in the walking sense that matters so much. That only gets a part of your question, but hopefully it's helpful.